We are recording. Let's get started. Okay. Many moons ago, we were discussing the 4 major biogeochemical cycles. Remember, the key here is we were talking about how energy is flowing ultimately through ecosystems, right? And so we know ultimately that energy flows on a global scale, right? Because you can't lose or make energy. But from a local perspective, okay, we really care about how, back this up a little bit here. Now these guys, all right, how nutrients and chemical elements are cycling locally, right? Because while large-scale energy can be abundant, that oftentimes is either in a form that is not valuable, or it can be moved out of the system and therefore is also unavailable. So when we're looking at these cycles, we're really interested in them as a way of understanding how energy is cycling in a way that keeps chemicals or keeps these nutrients available to organisms at this local scale. Okay, the replacement of that chemical stock. Okay, so we started by talking about water. Okay, water is sort of this easy, tangible thing. All organisms. I have hair in my mask today, and it's really one of those things that I think is the first stage of madness. All organisms need water at some level or another. Okay. So this was the last thing that we had talked about before that we did our discussion. I did notice, by the way, I think the dates in my syllabus is wrong, which is why that kind of went wonky. So I will get that fixed as well. And so we had talked, of course, about the big processes. When we sort of think about cloud, whoa, we didn't need that. Go even smaller. You know, clouds, raining, evaporation, returning it. Okay. That was easy enough to understand, but we also wanted to remember how plants and groundwater plays into this. Okay, so specifically transpiration. This, remember, we talked about happens at a small scale, so transpiration is the movement of water up a plant. Okay, so it certainly moves up a grass blade, but that's ultimately not going to make large impacts, even though there's a lot of grass. This often is more important when we think about trees. So we get water moving up the tree trunk and then evaporating off broad leaves. Okay? And so any tree does this, and this certainly has extremely large impacts when you think about dense forested areas. Okay, this is often why areas like rainforests are so rainy, right? Because you continually get the cycling of the water from those trees, right? And it creates their own sort of like mini ecosystem of condensation, evaporation, and precipitation. Okay. So we had just finished up water. I do want to pause and make sure no one had any questions about that before we move on to our next cycle. I don't know why this light thing apparently is its own. It's fine. Okay, so the next one we're going to talk about is carbon. Carbon is obviously also a big one because on Earth, all organisms are carbon-based. So all of the chemical structures in our body have a carbon-based backbone. And so it ends up being a really important element to intake and utilize for structural components. Okay, and so that's one of the key features, is because it creates this framework, right, of all living organisms, it becomes essential, right? if you want to grow, if you want to reproduce, you need to intake a lot of carbon. Okay. This also means then that organic, of course, means living, right? Keep that in mind. And inorganics, there's two forms of carbon. You can actually intake both, but it's more expensive to convert inorganic carbon into an organic part of your body. Okay. So this is, again, when we want to think about accessibility of nutrients. Okay. And so organic carbon, we would think about that Wolverine. That was the angry animal that was eating and pooping on the previous screen. Okay, he's going to be eating organic carbon because that's going to be the easiest thing to take in, assimilate into his body to grow, okay, or use it to reproduce. Okay, inorganic. Okay, so he's going to be using this stuff. Most inorganic carbon, okay, and we're going to find this is a common story, most inorganic carbon needs to be altered before it's taken in by usually mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, right? So this is the job of bacteria, fungi, and some plants to convert inorganics into organics. And we'll see this is the same story for the biologically unavailable forms of phosphorus and nitrogen and all of that. Okay. Us leggy creatures are very ineffective about the types of things that we can take in. And so it's sort of the job of everything else on the planet to fix it for us. Quite literally, we call it fixing. Okay. It's nitrogen fixing, phosphorus fixing. All right, so there's carbon fixing organisms that's going to convert. And we can see that here, okay, convert these back and forth, okay. Bye. No, I cleared you, and we need to stop. Okay, so as far as carbon goes, we've talked about this a little bit already, right? Carbon was the star of the show when we talked about greenhouse gases. Okay, well, we didn't get in a lot of detail there, partly because we didn't want to spend a lot of time on that. There is a ton of carbon on Earth. A lot of it is in that inorganic form. In fact, most of it, right? Because all of the sedentary rock that's on Earth is a form of carbon, one way or another. And that is, in fact, the largest pool of carbon. Okay. Most organisms can't do much with that. Okay, some bacteria can, some fungi can, a handful of invertebrates can, say like earthworms, for example, if you're dirt eaters. Okay, but for the most part, right, you're not going to see a reptile go out, take 5 chunks of dirt, and be fine. Right? We're not getting our carbon source this way. Even animals that eat dirt aren't using it to get carbon. Okay, so some birds eat dirt, some antelope eat dirt, but they're not doing it to get carbon. They're usually doing it to get minerals and salts. Okay, so things like calcium or sodium, things that would normally be difficult to get in their diet. Right, some birds that eat dirt even may do it to get charcoal. Okay, so if they're eating some kind of poisonous insect, okay, they use it to detoxify themselves, but they're still not using it to get the core of their carbon in their diet. Okay, it's just not something leggy animals' digestive systems are really well equipped to do. Okay, so for the most part, okay, what we're getting our stuff from is other leggy things, right? Animal biomass or plants, okay, if our stomachs are well equipped to break down plant material. And then dissolved carbons, okay, again, depending on the organism. So, for example, if I'm a clam sitting on the bottom of the ocean, I'm able to pull that carbon in. Okay. Now, the rest of this, of course, is atmospheric, right? We have a lot of carbon dioxide Okay, we're able to break that down and incorporate that. And so if you remember back to Bio-130 or maybe cell biology, okay, the incorporation or the release of carbon dioxide in all cells is important, glycolysis and all that bit. Okay. And of course, we can think about fossil fuels, which is actually humans doing crap with that. Okay. So the ability to break some stuff that's been stored in rock. Okay. Fossils are technically not rock, right? They're organisms that have died, okay, but are buried in the rock. So it's technically a form of lost plant and animal biomass that's buried in the rock, but it's lost. Okay, so should be stored and is no longer stored. Okay. Any questions about this? All right. So when you think about bioavailable carbon, it's sort of like water, right? Overall, for any given organism, the bioavailable amount of carbon is relatively small compared to what the total amount of carbon in the actual planet is. Okay, and this is where the idea of like fixers come from and conversion. Okay, so here's where all that fixers and processes, oops, that's probably not helping you guys, is it? Come from. Okay, most of this you're probably familiar with. Okay, so we know that processes like photosynthesis, okay, by plants, and I really, again, I'm going to harken the algae, okay. We like to think trees do most of the work, but on a global scale, algae actually does more photosynthesis than trees do. So we're going to show our algae a little love, okay. But this is, of course, pulling that CO2 from the atmosphere down, okay, converting it, so they're using that CO2, okay, that carbon then becomes part of them. Okay. We know, of course, again, hearkening, cell respiration, okay, utilizing all of those carbs and sugars. Okay. That's a major way that you are utilizing carbon-based molecules to create energy and assimilate carbon into your cellular structure. Okay, and certainly for us, it's probably the most intuitive and one that we've heard a million times. Okay. I know we've hollered about fossil fuels already, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. Okay, but the burning of wood, okay, and the digging up of a reservoir, okay, a long buried reservoir of carbon is actually, of carbon that's buried, and so adding a bunch of extra CO2. Okay, now that does make it biologically available, right? So as buried fossils, okay, and often as wood, right? There's a very few number of creatures that can eat wood. Okay, termites being one of the few that can actually process the carbon in wood. Okay, you're making it more bioavailable. That being said, okay, there's already plenty, and we talked about that already. Okay, the other process here, and we'll talk about these a lot, volcanoes, and when we talk about nitrogen, we'll talk about lightning. Volcanoes and lightning are some of the few processes that can pull and convert carbon from these bio-unavailable forms to available forms. Okay, so ash, for example, is a really fertile carbon-based form, right, that gets dumped down. Right, so we're dumping really heavy carbon-based material. It sounds terrible, right, for humans, it's awful. But it's not once it lands and it's fine, right, when the sulfur-based crap goes away, because that's poisonous, right? But the carbon that comes down is not. Right? Have you ever been to like an ash beach or a forest that's been covered with ashy soil? Those are all really healthy areas. Okay? because the high energy of a volcano is actually really nutrient rich, because the high energy is able to convert the carbon, the nitrogen, and the phosphorus into really bioavailable forms. Okay, and it also releases good carbon into the air. Okay, so a lot of these high energy processes are good, right? Ideally, and we're not talking about ones that happen every 10 minutes, right? These are rare events, and when they do happen, right, the succession on the ecosystem is very good, right, because we've added a whole bunch. Okay. The black smoky stuff, that's all sulfur. That's bad. Sulfur stinks. Unless you're like 3 bacteria. Then it's great. Okay, any questions about this stuff? Okay, so this is one of the few kind of familiar things that we've talked about. All right, so let's talk about nitrogen then, if we don't have any questions. Let me touch back in on Miranda. And Miranda, if you you can pop into the chat, but if you feel like you have a question and I'm not checking in, you gotta holler, okay? Okay, let's talk about nitrogen. So nitrogen and phosphorus for our last two to talk about. And these are two more sort of classically important nutrients. Okay? Not that water and carbon aren't. Okay. So classically limiting, right? So plants fight over this, and it's often missing, particularly in higher altitude areas, boreal forest, the taiga, okay, and mountains. This is also important to all living organisms, right? This is a core component of all your proteins, amino acids, and it's a core component to DNA and RNA, right? So the nucleic acids. So again, all living organisms need to consume large amounts of nitrogen. Okay? And as we're going to find with carbon, the forms in which that you can intake nitrogen is limited, right? And this is why it's a limiting nutrient. For most organisms, okay, and this is plants as well, okay, it's not just sad walking things, there's really only 2 forms of nitrogen that you can actually intake. Okay? Some bacteria and fungi have it a little bit easier. Okay, so this is why it's such a limiting nutrient. Okay. So it sounds silly, but just like with water, and this is where this comes from, there's actually a ton of nitrogen. So the vast majority of the air around us is nitrogenous. Okay, a gross amount. Okay, gross being a lot, not disgusting. Although nitrogen actually kills you. Right, so people that are diving underwater and get what's called the bends, where they get really sick and vomit and suffocate, are actually usually dying from nitrogen poisoning, because the ratio of oxygen to nitrogen in their dive tubes gets wrong because they've come up too quick. So technically also disgusting, gross. But large amounts of nitrogen in the atmosphere. Problem is, for the vast majority of living organisms on Earth, it's absolutely useless, hence the dying while diving bit. Ultimately, only a handful of bacteria and some fungi can handle it like this, and some weird deep sea creatures. So this N2 form is really, really difficult to utilize. So the form that's in these last 2 boxes, okay, in the biomass, well, in some soils, depending, and that's in the water, is ultimately in what's called nitrates and nitrites. That's one form. And ammonia. Yellow is really terrible. Let's not use yellow. How about that? Wait a second. Looks really clear on my screen, but I have a feeling it looks like garbage on yours. That's better, right? Yeah, that's way better. Let's do that. Okay. So most of the organisms on Earth have to consume nitrogen as a nitrate or as ammonia. Right? And you already kind of can figure off the top of your head that most organisms can't even do both of that, right? We're not going to go around glugging ammonia. That's already problematic. Okay? And you're right off the top of your head that half of these are food and half of these are waste products for most organisms. So this is extraordinarily problematic as we think about the cycle of nitrogen. Okay, so every organism definitely has its niche. Okay, so if we think about fish, okay, pee ammonia, eat nitrate. So do we, for that matter. Okay. Pee, kind of a form of ammonia. We use it to clean our countertops. Okay, and the food that we eat has nitrate in it. Right? And that's how most organisms work. Okay. Many plants have a lot more flexibility. They can take kind of a little bit of both. Okay. But it's very limiting. So good so far? Okay. So here's our nitrogen problem. Okay. Here's the key and the reason it's such a problem. Okay. Without humans involved, okay, nitrogen is super limiting, which is generally a good thing. Okay. For the most part, there's not a lot of ways to get nitrate or ammonia out of N2 gas. Okay. We can, like I said, there's a few bacteria that'll do it, or again, high energy processes. So lightning will do it. Okay, so really big form, storm will drop a bunch of nitrate on the ground. Okay. And this is a loop, right? Natural processes are cycles. So for everything that we create, okay, so we turn the gas into nitrate or nitrite. Okay, we convert stuff back to the gas. Okay, so there's a handful of plants and a few bacteria that eat that nitrate, okay, and release it back into the gas form. Okay, and this is normal. Right? When we think about any resource, dang it. Any resource, right? Whether it's a single nutrient, whether it's a food, whether it's a shelter, okay, competing over these resources is common. Okay, and so there shouldn't be an overflow of these things because weird stuff happens when there's too much. Now, just like with carbon, okay, humans had to muck this one up too. Okay, and my intent is not to turn this into like the last episode of the David Attenborough, where we're human shaming, but we did sort of mess this one up, and so that's what these two turned into. Okay, so humans have added some extra nitrogen, and this is why in areas that are not boreal and not mountainous, that you don't tend to find that nitrogen is a limiting nutrient anymore. Okay, because there's a lot of human inputs that have exceeded the general nitrogen limitation or competition needs. Okay, the first of which is, of course, fertilizer. Okay, this is a lot to do with our flyover states. Okay, so by dumping a lot of fertilizer on, which does make our crops grow better, putting it on the crops is not that big of a deal. Okay, it's the runoff from the crops that creates the problem. So it rains, and then the fertilizer isn't on the crops anymore, right? It runs down from our farms into ponds and waters. Okay, so then those get really mucked up. So we've all seen a lake or a pond that has looked kind of like a sludge fest. Okay, that's usually from a human input where a whole bunch of that fertilizer has come in. It's created an algae bloom. Okay, because algae like all that nitrogen just as much as the corn or the soybeans does. Okay, you get the same issue from this running off into forests. You'll get a weird bloom of shrubberies or invasive species that would otherwise normally have not gotten in there, and it can sometimes kill off other organisms that would normally have thrived. And we have a whole unit about 3/4 of the way through the semester where we'll talk quite a bit about invasive species and how those kind of tend to do their thing anyway. But these types of inputs really lay the groundwork for new organisms to thrive and outpace. And once those sorts of organisms get in, you can't really undo the damage anymore. The other big issue is what's called NOx, and that's this here. So we can see the base formula looks a lot like nitrite or nitrate, right? And that's because it can be in either form. And if you've heard this word used before, NOx is what comes out of the back of your car. It's one of the main components in exhaust. So there's a lot of things that come out of the back of your car. But NOx is one of the major components that come out, and it's also one of the major components of smog. My accent came out there, and it turned into like the dragon from The Hobbit, but it's fine, I guess both work. So smog is sort of that blackish fog, right? Smoke fog is where the term comes from, unless you say it with a Midwestern accent, and then there's like an AU in there, and it's fine. And so the components from there make it reactive, and so all that's happening is it's reacting with some of the particulates that are also coming out of the car, as well as the particulates that are also already in our cities. And that's why you kind of get this dense, thick, foggy crap that's in the air. And so aside from the fact that it's just disgusting generally, it does have a lot of additional nutrient inputs into it. And this stuff becomes particularly nasty because as it goes into the ecosystems, it carries with it fertilizer. So it's still going to do all the damage we just talked about, but it is bound with a lot of pollutant particles as well. So it ends up doing a lot of damage to the ecosystems. So NOx is really nasty stuff. Okay. That stuff all cities have, but usually only the really big cities, places like LA, for example, have a lot of problems with it, destroying the outlying areas. And that's why really big cities, you don't tend to see lush greenery around them, because those sorts of areas don't tend to survive. Also, then they get paved over. No, I didn't, wrong button. We don't need pictures of this. Okay, good on this so far? Okay, so let's talk about phosphorus. So nitrogen and phosphorus are the two biggest nutrients as far as living organisms go. Now, just like nitrogen, phosphorus is a major part of our DNA, right? It makes it the backbone. Also makes up phospholipids. Remember, phospholipids, check on Miranda too. phospholipids make up your plasma membrane. Okay, so sort of important. Okay, and all cells on the planet then need phosphorus. Okay, so that's important. Okay, it's important in ATP, right? So any energy molecule, okay, same thing with GTP, which is the other major type of energy molecule. Okay, all of these are going to use phosphorus. Okay, and any organism that has true bone, right? Because remember, these are calcium phosphate components. Okay, so true fishes and up are all going to need a lot of phosphorus. Okay, so again, one way or the other, you need to take in a lot of phosphorus. Okay. Now, phosphorus does end up being a limiting nutrient because nitrogen is so abundant. Okay, most organisms do not need to end up fighting over nitrogen and instead find themselves fighting over phosphorus. Right, something is going to be the least common thing. So in most cases now, phosphorus is the least common nutrient, at least down off the mountaintops. Okay, and again, for the main reasons that we saw with carbon. Okay, because just like carbon, where most of the carbon is bound up in old rocks, same thing with phosphorus. Okay, old rocks has a lot of the phosphorus, right? Both carbon and phosphorus isn't counterintuitive as it sounds. It's actually a hard mineral in its purest form. It gets bound up with iron and with calcium, and it makes rock. Okay, and so over a global scale, this is where most of it is. Okay, and again, we ain't rock chewers. So this is how most of us are going about getting this. It's not available to us. Okay. So for most of us, we have this teeny pool. Okay, we can eat each other. That's where we get it, right? And then like the carbon, okay, there's quite a bit of it in the water itself. And so if you're living in the water, you can filter that out. So again, if you're a clam, you have a little bit of an advantage there. Okay. But with these nutrients, where the vast majority of the pool is cycling it around just by eating each other, okay, that's a risky, you have no idea how many times I do that. That's a risky pool, okay? So if you have a big migration where a population leaves the area, okay, where you have it, might have a disease come in and kill off all the elms maybe, okay, then that's a large pool of organisms that you can no longer get carbon or you can no longer get phosphorus from. And then these nutrients get significantly more difficult to get, right? The competition for those nutrients gets significantly more difficult to get. Okay, so you can start to see where some of these cycles are having harder times than others, might have harder times than others. Okay, so where do we actually cycle in phosphorus? Okay, so not surprisingly, since, excuse me, I just said a lot of the phosphorus comes from organisms, okay? Two of the biggest processes are from organisms, right? Eating, existing, and dying. Okay, so organisms assimilate phosphorus into themselves. Okay, PO4 is just phosphate. Phosphate is pretty much the only biologically available form of phosphorus. Okay, unlike nitrogen where we had multiple forms, you pretty much eat phosphate or you don't do anything. Okay, so producers can pull PO4 from the soil. Okay, so producers raise like a plant. So they can pull some of it up by their roots. So they're assimilating it into their body. So we have it in an organism, on grass, and a leaf. Okay, then that gets passed around. The rabbit eats the leaf. The mouse takes the cheese. Right. Okay, mouse dies. Okay, decomposed. Bacteria gets some of it. Soil gets some of it. Okay. Otherwise, we do get a little bit, right? It doesn't stay in those rocks forever. Okay. But this is a slow process. So when we say weathering from rocks, okay, this is a natural process. This is not something humans really largely are doing here. Okay, this is the sea spray slowly over time wearing down some hardcore rocks. This is not limestone we're talking about here. This is not a soft rock that we're destroying. But that phosphate does slowly come down and go back into the water or into the nearby soil where it can become biologically available. Okay. Unlike nitrogen or carbon or water, there is not phosphate in the atmosphere as a gas. Right? There's no gaseous phosphorus. Okay. So we can move it around in the atmosphere, right? It can bind with water for a little while. You can end up with it as dust. Okay, moving as one of those terrifying dust clouds that goes from the Sahara to Puerto Rico or something. But this isn't 80% of the atmosphere or 20% of the atmosphere like nitrogen and carbon dioxide were respectively, right? We don't have rain clouds of phosphorus. So this is really one of those minerals or nutrients that exists largely at a local scale. Okay? You either have a pool of phosphorus or you don't. Okay? Organisms move in with the phosphorus or they leave with the phosphorus. Okay? You're not just going to suddenly have a giant rock wall appear in your ecosystem and now you just have more phosphorus. Okay? The glaciers moved out a long time ago. Oh, we're not going to see that again in our lifetime, right? So it is what it is as far as phosphorus goes. That's not a hugely changing one. Okay, so I'm going to introduce, any questions about the phosphorus before I move on? Or any of the four that we've talked about? Water, carbon, nitrogen, or phosphorus? Can I just hide you? Okay. Okay. Yep, that didn't do anything. Let's just click on it a few more times. Okay, so with a little bit of time we have left, I'm going to introduce the case study that we have, but we're not actually going to start it because there's not enough time to do that. So on Wednesday, I guess, we will start looking at the case study. So if you don't already, bring some kind of electronic device with you on Wednesday, and I will try to remind you. And Miranda, we will find a much better way than what happened last week, I promise. Okay, so real life instance of this from my old neck of the woods. in New England. So the Hubbard Brook is in New Hampshire. Okay, I'm from Maine, in case you didn't know that. So the White Mountains of New Hampshire is still a temperate area for the most part. So we have this nice deciduous-like forest here. Okay, and ultimately we have several different valleys, which are each have their own unique creek system. And so nicely, because this one happened to have been cut, you can see the individual creek system that each of these valley was drained by. Okay. Now underneath the creek, and why this is such a good experimental site, was impenetrable bedrock. And let me tell you, after gardening in this area, like this whole area has hardcore bedrock underneath, most of which, if you're curious, is like Cadillac mountain granite, which makes very expensive countertops. Okay? But all that aside, man, super tough rock that even water doesn't like to go through. It just kind of slides down like really laminated flooring. Okay? And so basically the idea is whatever's going over the top of this bedrock, right, you're not losing anything through the ground. Okay. And so what they were interested in doing is figuring out what's called a mineral budget. In other words, what is each valley using? Okay, so sort of like a financial budget. Okay. How much is going in? So how much am I making? How much am I making? Okay, for nutrients. Okay. And how much do I have at the end of the month? Okay. So, in other words, how much is each forested area actually using for nutrients? Okay, so we know how many milligrams of nitrogen is going in, how many milligrams of nitrogen is coming out. So then we have an idea of how much nitrogen is that forested area actually using. That make sense? Okay, so that was their goal. And they did this for all sorts of stuff: nitrogen, phosphorus, calcium, right? To get an idea of how much is the plants and animals or whatever using. Okay. We could also do the same thing for water. Okay, because we have flow rate. So we could see how much rain is going in. We have how much water is going in at the beginning of the creek and how much water is coming out at the bottom of the creek. Okay, so the idea is to figure out how much water is also lost. Okay, and remember, there's multiple ways to lose water, but really we were interested in this evapotranspiration idea, right? The stuff that's climbing up through the plants and being lost through the trees. Okay, so this is going to set us up for our study, and ultimately our goal is to look at the importance of different plants and the density of plants in some drainage systems. Okay, so we're going to look at that on Wednesday. That feels so far away, doesn't it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Didn't even take it. Okay, so that'll be all for today.